for America of New Hampshire. I am Elaine Driscoll, State Director, and I'm so glad that you're here with us on this particular show. We are going to be talking about legislation here in New Hampshire on this particular show. And in particular, we are going to be talking about a bill, HB 228, which is a bill that prohibits funding of taxpayer funding to abortion aid organizations. And here to help us understand this whole piece of legislation, and you are the sponsor of it as well, is Representative Warren Groen, and you're out of Rochester.
Yes.
So welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you very much for coming. And again, we were talking about this particular bill, and I know you've been working on this bill for quite a while now. You got a whole year behind it.
Yep.
And so a little bit of the history, if you would just let us and the viewers understand what's going on with this bill, why it's important for them to know about it.
Okay. Well, it was introduced, I was just a co-sponsor, and it was introduced by another member who was overwhelmed by a lot of his other bills, and then he asked another rep to take it over, which he did, and then it got to a critical juncture in committee where then that member was tied up with local politics, and something had to be done overnight, and so then I got heavily involved in going to the committee.
Isn't that the way it goes?
Yeah, it's the great part of being a volunteer legislator. Things get pushed around a lot.
Yeah.
And no staff, of course, so if you don't do it yourself, it doesn't
get done. Yes, I understand.
And so then I got very involved in trying to shepherd it through committee. Mm-hmm. And there was some problems with the original bills, and so we drafted an amendment on short notice to deal with some of those issues, which is pretty common that you get in a committee and you have all these different people thinking all different ways, and they say, oh, what about this? And you go, and think about that. And so we drafted another amendment, but they did turn down the amendment, and we drafted another amendment, and they turned it down. So what's coming before the House is actually the original bill, which we don't even intend to come before the House. We had an intended amendment, but of course the committee killed the amendments, so it's the original bill that necessarily then comes before the House.
But this bill has been through multiple subcommittees and as well as executive sessions. It was retained, and then in this past October is when the executive committee actually voted on the bill, and at that time decided that it was going to be inexpedient to legislate.
Right, and it wasn't a unanimous vote. I believe it was 8-5.
Okay.
But we did lose that vote in committee, and of course we're not satisfied with that. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think this information needs to be made public.
Absolutely.
And I think that every opportunity needs to be used to explain what this bill is trying to do and how this affects our culture, how this affects our state, and how this affects taxpayer dollars.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that about, because we also know that at this point our executive council has ended the contract with the federal government to subsidize abortion providing organizations in our state. And so why shouldn't our state laws coincide in supporting that same train that's driving it? Obviously, there's enough of our citizens here that feel that, yes, it's a choice that you can make, and yes, it's legal if you decide you want to end the life of your child, but it should not be the responsibility of your neighbor to pay for that. That's your personal decision, and
correct.
You should be able to take care of that decision yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I decided to have hip surgery, I don't expect everybody else in the neighborhood to go and pay for my hip surgery, right? It's my personal decision to do that, and therefore I should take care of it myself. At least that's the way I feel about it. So with this particular bill, it has been ITL'd, but you're planning to try to fight for it, is the term that we use a lot on the general court, and you're going to bring it up, and you're hoping to get that ITL overturned. Mm-hmm. And
there are, with a 3-1 Republican majority, I didn't anticipate we would have this kind of difficulty. But there are committee members who don't, they're not loyal to the Republican platform, and they don't subscribe to conservative Republican ideals, and therefore they didn't go along with it. and I'm well aware of how the system works. You know, I've killed other bills that I didn't think were good bills, and so they came after me on this one. So all's fair in love and war, and we're in a war, so that's how it works.
You know, that's interesting because Representative Dan Ince, who's also a friend of mine, he also says that being a legislature is actually being in war.
It is.
And you're learning how to negotiate and position.
Yep. It is the war of ideas and persuasion.
Yes, absolutely, but it's the best place for it to be, right?
It's where it belongs, and that's why this is an ongoing battle, and I don't plan to give up until there's no hope left. And I keep seeing hope.
I think we have a lot of hope.
We do?
We have a lot of hope. And,
Yep.
you know, on a more national level, we also are seeing that, like you were saying earlier, that there's one organization that's the gorilla in the room, and that happens to be Planned Parenthood, though this bill that we're talking about here in New Hampshire is geared toward all organizations that would be abortion providers, correct?
That is correct.
But they happen to be the biggest and the largest, not only in the state but nationwide. And there was a newspaper article released today in the news that said that for taxpayer funding, they received $487 million from taxpayers to fund their business on a national level. It just seems an astronomical amount of money to end the life of babies.
It does. It boggles the mind that's happening, that kind of an organization would get that kind of government support. If it was a private organization, we really wouldn't have anything to say about it, because they can gather their money and spend their money as they see fit. But when it becomes an issue of public funding, then it's a whole other issue.
Exactly.
And I'm often accused of singling out Planned Parenthood, and this bill does not single out Planned Parenthood. You mentioned the gorilla, that it's hard to ignore the gorilla in the room, or the 800-pound gorilla in the room, especially when there's only one gorilla. When at all these hearings, I've never had a ma and pa abortion clinic show up to oppose this bill. It's always Planned Parenthood. So the face of abortion in New Hampshire is Planned Parenthood. They're the ones that are throwing all the money at it. And I thought it's interesting, they, on their funding, when their funding was stripped by the Executive Council, one of their people, Jennifer Purcell, she said, "We can't even provide patients with antibiotics for urinary tract infections or STDs anymore because their funding was cut back." And I think their state funding was actually cut back to the tune of $978,000. It was a matching grant that came to 1-point-some million. But it's interesting to point out that they're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, Planned Parenthood of New England, and in 2009, they had a surplus. Now, in my business, that would be called a profit. Mm-hmm. They had a surplus in 2009 of $21 million.
Wow.
And they had a surplus in 2010 of $5.6 million. At that same time, they spent $678,000 on public affairs. They spent $151,000 on lobbying. They spent $445,000 on improving their brand, and another $206,000 they transferred to their Northern New England Political Action Fund and Political Action Committee. That's almost $1.5 million that they spent on lobbying, branding, political activities, public affairs. So it's interesting that when they lost some government funding, the first thing they did is they cut out a bunch of poor people and said, "No, you can't have your antibiotics for your urinary tract infection. It's more important that we spend money on lobbying, branding, this and that and the other thing." So, hey, they're a private company. They get to spend their money however they wish. But it's also possible or proper that we point out the hypocrisy of it.
Yes.
And then there's the whole idea that, well, they're not just a private corporation because they get almost $500 million of government money. Well, now we do have a say about that, and we should have a say about it.
Exactly. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but are there very many organizations in our state or our nation, for that fact, that are private but get public funding?
Well, unfortunately, since President Obama has taken over, there are lots more of those organizations.
Oh, there are. Okay.
You know, we could go into long lists of them.
Right.
Most of the money's been squandered. We all know what they did for GM and the calamity that's been. But that's another issue, and we'll get to that later. But Planned Parenthood definitely stands out, unique in its area of endeavor.
And I know that I attended many of those subcommittee meetings, and about that time when the meetings were being held was when the organization exposed Planned Parenthood was operating, which is led by Lila Rose, and she had her organization made videotapes where they actually went into some of the clinics and were acting as clients, and the response from the staff that was there it was mind-boggling. The way they were responding. In one particular case, there were two actors that were posing as what's the word?
A pimp and a prostitute.
Yes, thank you. And and saying, well, we know he was saying these girls are illegal, they're here illegally, and we don't want the government to know about that. And the staff were saying, no, we'll make sure that none of that gets into the paperwork. I mean, how can this be allowed to continue like this? And there's like no investigations going on into it. There's, this is just.
It's very interesting. The reason that I was aware of that is because I used to live in New Jersey, and I used to protest at that clinic where that happened when I lived in New Jersey. And Lila Rose she did a great job of exposing that. And in our committee hearing, we brought that up.
Yes.
And one of the opposition state reps said, yeah, those tapes are all made up and that's just a farce.
Right, I heard that.
But as we brought it up later, the lobbyists for Planned Parenthood did have to admit a couple minutes later, because it was so much egg on their face, yes, we did fire that woman because she wasn't doing what our mission was. So I thought that was very interesting that it was denied, and immediately they had to jump in and say, no, we fired her. And so that happens all the time. Lila Rose has gone into numbers of clinics and exposed them. They've been aiding in sex trafficking. They've been aiding in getting abortions for prostitutes.
Minor children. I call them minor children.
Statutory rape,
children.
Unreported statutory rape. And it goes with the business. When you're in the business of killing babies for a living, well, it's not a big step to go out to say, well, we'll do a little white lie or a little bigger lie over here to solve some of these problems for our customers. It's not like there's a great deal of moral principle involved in this business. And so they find it very easy to do that.
Well, Lila also did other investigative things where they actually made phone calls because Planned Parenthood was saying, well, women won't be able to get mammograms, if we don't have funding, and et cetera, et cetera. So they actually did phone calls. They had an actor, again, who called different Planned Parenthood centers around the nation. I mean, it was several different states. And the actor simply asked if they could make an appointment for a mammogram, and every single time they were told, no, we don't do those.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that are not adding up when it comes to this organization, and it's important for people to understand that that the reason that we're so adamant about defunding this organization is because they aren't operating above. They're doing things under the table. They're endangering our children, and like you said, they're aiding and abetting in human trafficking.
Yep.
So that we have a lot of reason for not wanting to support this organization with our money.
That's right. That's
with
right.
Our money.
And I recall going through Ellis Island a number of times when we lived in New Jersey. We had relatives come, we would take them through Ellis Island. And I remember looking at all the things that happened to the immigrants as they came through Ellis Island and how many of them were tested and sent back because they were deemed to be inferior or they had problems that would not make them good citizens. And I thought, well, that's not a bad idea that we just accept anybody willy-nilly, except that it was a eugenics process that was being applied to the immigrants at Ellis Island. To our shame, and it eventually was corrected, but to our shame, it was the eugenics movement that was influencing screening out people from Europe.
I did not know that.
And it's a logical extension of the founders' vision. We may not agree with, let's say, Planned Parenthood and their business model and the things that they believe and teach. But the one thing you have to hand them is they are remarkably true to the vision of their founder. Their founder was very deeply involved in the eugenics movement, and she believed that the Irish and the Italians and blacks, people like that, were human weeds and need to be plucked from the human garden.
That was Margaret Sanger.
Margaret Sanger, yes.
And she was also a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party.
Indeed, she was an admirer of Hitler, and she had a project called the Negro Project that she set up, and it was purposely to prevent them from reproducing because they were an inferior race. And I find it very interesting that they're heavily concentrated in New York City, and the number of abortions of blacks that they do in the greater New York City metropolitan area far outstrips the black population. It would seem that they are targeting blacks.
Well, I would agree with you, and not only because my parents live in Florida, and they were involved in supporting a local ministry that ministered to young pregnant girls. And Planned Parenthood tried to put a center right behind them. And they fortunately fought very hard and got a lot of community support, and so Planned Parenthood was not able to succeed, but they seem to identify areas where they think that they can draw upon that type of background.
And I'm aware also that, I think it was Lila Rose that did this or someone else, but I heard the tape recordings of where they called and solicited to give donations to a clinic if that clinic used that scholarship to get rid of black children. And this actor did it under the guise of, my son was turned down because of affirmative action, things like that.
Right.
And the lady that answered the phone or talked to him was more than willing to take the money. More than willing. She was very accommodating and very understanding. We fought the Civil War to get rid of that kind of an attitude toward blacks.
And
we passed all kinds of civil rights legislation because of the racist problems that we had in the United States. And so in this day and age, to have an organization that gets all this government money with racist intent is very disturbing.
It is. That
they exist at all. It's a free country, so they're allowed to exist. But that they get my taxpayer money and your taxpayer money,
absolutely.
Don't think that's right.
And I know I received an email from a gentleman, I won't reveal his name, but he was very upset because he was in Manchester, and one of the immigration centers, and Planned Parenthood was there soliciting all the immigrants that were coming in from like Kenya and other areas, trying to get them to come to the clinics, and so.
One of the things that has been thrown up against this bill, they said if you defund them, all these women are going to go without these services, these women's health services. And it's like, well, they're the only place that can minister to the needs of poor people. Well, I know that if you wave a government contract in front of organizations and say, hey, come and get money, there will be people coming from all over the state to perform those family planning programs. I'm aware of several of them that are ready and available now. And if you start waving government money, saying come and get it,
lots of people will show up.
They will show up. They will show up.
They will show up. And the fact is we do have community health centers that do provide those different services. They don't do necessarily abortion services. They will refer out for those, but they do provide mammogram screenings and contraceptive methods. They'll provide family planning and other types of counseling as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that was one of my original questions to one of the subcommittees is why are we doubling the efforts here? Why are we doing that? If we already have community health centers, why do we need another organization here to do that? So
Exactly right. Completely agreed.
yeah, I think it kind of fell on deaf ears.
It did.
But
It did. But the truth is the truth, and we have to keep putting the truth out there.
Yes, and you know what I thought was also very interesting during those subcommittee meetings is that several times committee members asked to see the financial books of Planned Parenthood, and they were just absolutely flatly turned down. I mean, it was not even trying to hedge around it. It was like a flat no. And I'm wondering how can an organization that gets that much money from the taxpayer be allowed to keep its books closed?
Because they've gotten it by with it legally for so long, there are other states that are requiring that they open their books if they're going to get taxpayer money. The simple fact is that money is fungible.
Yes.
I've had it where, I had a guy ask me for help because he didn't have money to feed his family, and so I gave him some money, and lo and behold, he showed up with a new laptop, And so what I did is I bought his groceries, which freed up money for him to buy a laptop. Now, I don't mind that he's got a laptop, but if he had his priorities straight, he would have put that laptop money first into groceries to feed his family, and then show up with the toys later. And in the same way, if somebody helps me pay my fuel bill and my electric bill and my house payment, well, that frees up the other money I earn to use for this or that or the other thing. And money is fungible in the same way in Planned Parenthood, in any other abortion organization, any other family planning organization. If you're paying the cost of their brick and mortar and freeing up the normal maintenance of brick and mortar, well, they can divert that other money wherever they need to. And I think that's what happens. Texas, I think, did a really good job. They passed a law that said that Planned Parenthood and other organizations had to bifurcate their services. So if they wanted to do family planning and do abortions, they had to have separate organizations, separate buildings, separate boards of directors, separate streams of income, all of that, so that they couldn't possibly mix the two.
Mix the taxpayer support for regular women's health issues, services.
Correct. Yes, and that went to court several times, and the state of Texas won every time. And they've had ample opportunity to appeal that to the Supreme Court. They're no stranger to the Supreme Court, and they've chosen not to. Tells me they realize that that's the way the future is going to be. And I have high hopes that we can bring those kind of things to New Hampshire at some point.
That would be wonderful.
Indeed.
I mean, at least from my perspective, probably not for those who are in support of Planned Parenthood, but
and they are well acquainted with bifurcation of services, because in committee they repeatedly said to us, "Oh no, abortion care is only 3% of our services." And I remember that hit me, and I was flummoxed. I was like, "How can that be?" Because over 30% of their income comes from abortion. And I was like, boy, I'm a builder. I wish I had a business model that 3% of my business would generate 30% of my income. I think I'd focus on that. If I could charge $100,000 for the house and $97,000 of that came from the kitchen counters, well, I'd focus on kitchen counters.
Yeah.
It's that kind of a thing.
Right.
But then I figured out how they do it. They separate their services. So if we took their model and used it on me as I was going to get my annual physical, well, I would go in and they would do some paperwork for me, 1 service. They would put me on the scale and weigh me, 2 services. They would take my blood pressure, 3 services. They would look in my mouth and make me say, 4 services. Okay, look in my ears, 5 services. Take me down the hall and take a blood sample, 4 services, like that. And that's how they've done it. So they've bifurcated their services. So instead of charging someone for an abortion, they charge them for 20, 30, 40, 50 services related to that abortion. And then in many cases, they've been caught in other states where there are laws that force them to report. There's, I think in New York State, they're using a Civil War era law that Lincoln put in place to get vendors who were burning or defrauding the government. Mm-hmm. And they're using that law to go in and get information. And they're finding that they're billing Medicaid, they're billing state and federal organizations for everything but the actual abortion.
Okay.
And so they're well acquainted with bifurcation of services. We just need to make them aware that
it's got to be a physical bifurcation as well.
This should be a physical bifurcation of their services. That would be great.
And again, I think, as you and I were discussing earlier, that at this point in the history of our nation, it's important for all of us to understand that this type of ending the life of a child is a personal decision. It really is a personal decision, and by law, we know that it's a personal decision. Why should the taxpayer be responsible for that personal decision that person decides to make? We weren't involved in the act of making that child, so why should we be involved in the act of ending the life of that child? And at this point, I think most people would agree. If you want to take that action, that course of action, then it's your responsibility, and don't put it on the taxpayer to fund your decision. Representative Warren, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing.
You're very welcome.
We're going to keep our viewers and the members of CWA informed on this, and we'll be standing by ready to support you.
Thank you very much.
And we just appreciate you so much for coming in, and Happy New Year.
And a Happy New Year to you too.
Thank you, and join us again on our next show on Caring for New Hampshire, a Ministry of Concerned Women of America in New Hampshire. God bless you.